I worked the night shift on the memory care hall at a facility off Harding Pike in Nashville, and by early December of 2022, I was pretty sure something was wrong with 4 of my residents, but I could not put my finger on what. It started with Mr. Ellis. He was the kind of old man who used to correct my grammar when I brought him his evening meds, sharp for 88, even with the diagnosis. He recognized me by voice, called me sugar in that dry way old Southern men do when they mean it kindly. Then, in October, he stopped talking during my rounds. Just stopped. He would look at the wall, or at his hands, and when I asked if he wanted water, he would shake his head like a kid who had been told not to accept anything from strangers. His chart said nothing new. No infection. No stroke on imaging. The day nurses said he ate fine at breakfast. Then, Miss Ruth, on the other end of the hall, started doing the same thing. She had always been a talker, told me the same story about her wedding at the Belle Meade Club every night for the 11 months I had worked there, and I never once cut her off. In November, she stopped telling it. She sat in her chair by the window with her hands in her lap and watched the parking lot lights. And when I asked her about the wedding, she looked at me like I had asked her something rude. Mr. Delano and Miss Beverly followed within 2 weeks of each other. Same pattern. Quiet. Flinching when the phone rang. Beverly cried once when I tried to put lotion on her hands, and she could not tell me why. I brought it up at the shift huddle. The day charge nurse, a woman named Kim who had been there 15 years, said dementia patients cycle. She said sometimes they get a run of good months and then they drop, and there is not always a reason we can chart. She said it kindly. She was not wrong, in general, but I could not stop noticing the timing. All 4 of them had family that visited on my shift, or right before it. Not the same people, but the same last name showed up in the sign-in log, more often than I could explain with coincidence. A niece for Mr. Ellis, a nephew for Miss Ruth, a daughter-in-law for Mr. Delano, a younger cousin for Miss Beverly. Different faces, different addresses on the visitor log, all with the same surname or married into it. The family tree was wide, but it was one tree. I know how that sounds. I know families intermarry. I know Nashville is smaller than people think. I told myself I was pattern matching because I was tired. Then in the second week of December, I came on shift at 7, and Kayla was in Mr. Ellis's room with the door pushed almost closed. Kayla was the niece, late 30s, blonde, always came in with a Starbucks cup and a leather folio tucked under her arm. She was polite to the point of performance. She always signed in with a big, loopy signature and always asked the front desk if she could have a little private time with her uncle, because he opened up more when it was just family. The receptionist loved her. Everybody loved her. That night, I heard her voice through the door before I heard his. Hers was low and steady, the way you talk to a dog you are trying to keep calm. His was small. I could not make out the words. I stopped in the hall with the med cart, and I stood there for maybe 20 seconds, pretending to check the screen, listening. She was reading something out loud, not a book. It had the cadence of a form. I knocked and pushed the door open the same second. That is not how we are supposed to do it. We are supposed to wait for a response. I did not wait. She was sitting in the visitor chair, pulled up close enough that her knee was touching his. The folio was open across her lap, and there was a pen in Mr. Ellis's hand. His hand was shaking, not from Parkinson's. He did not have that, just shaking. The pen was on paper. When the door opened, she moved fast. She closed the folio and slid it into her tote in one motion, and she was already smiling by the time she looked up. "Hey, honey," she said. "We were just doing a crossword." Mr. Ellis was looking at the floor. His mouth was open a little. He was still holding the pen. There was no crossword anywhere. "Meds," I said, because I could not think of anything else. I set the little cup down on his tray. He did not look at it. Kayla stood up and stretched, like she had been sitting a long time, and told me she was going to head out. She kissed his forehead. He flinched. She did not seem to notice, or she was very good at not seeming to notice. I stepped aside and let her pass, and I watched her walk down the hall to the elevator, and I watched the leather folio under her arm the whole way. I sat with Mr. Ellis for a while after. I asked him if he was okay. He nodded. I asked him if he wanted me to call anyone. He shook his head. I asked him what Kayla had been reading to him. He looked at me for a long moment, and I watched him try to find the sentence and lose it. He said, "I don't remember." He said it the way people with his diagnosis say it when they know they should remember and cannot. And it is the saddest sound in that whole building. And I heard it 3 or 4 times a night, and I never got used to it. Before I left his room, I checked his trash can. There was a torn scrap of paper on top of a tissue. Just a corner, bank letterhead. I could not tell which bank. I put it in my pocket. I know I should not have. I did. At home the next morning, I sat at my kitchen table with the scrap and a cold cup of coffee, and I made a list. 4 residents, 4 visitors, same family. All 4 residents had gone quiet and small over roughly the same window. I pulled up the facility's visitor log on the staff portal on my phone, which we were allowed to do, and I cross-checked the sign-in times. Every visit from that family in the last 3 months had been logged as at least 90 minutes. Ours averaged 25. I wrote an email to the medical director that afternoon. His name was Dr. Bott. I had met him twice. I kept it short. I listed the 4 residents, the 4 visitors, the surname, the pattern of decline, what I had seen in Mr. Ellis's room, and the scrap of paper. I did not accuse anyone of anything. I said I was concerned, and I wanted it on record. I sent it, and then I could not sleep, which I was already bad at, being on nights. He called me the next day. He asked me to come in an hour before my shift. When I got there, he had the facility's attorney on speaker, a woman with a voice like she had been up since 4. They asked me to walk through it again. They asked me if I would be willing to say all of this in writing, formally. I said yes. The attorney explained what would happen next. Under Tennessee rules, with sign-off from each resident or their legal power of attorney, they could install cameras in the private rooms of the 4 residents I had flagged. She said the POA for 2 of them was actually a different family member, not the one visiting, and she thought she could get consent quickly. For the other 2, she would need a court to weigh in. She said it in a flat, procedural voice, and it was the first time in weeks I had felt anything settle in my chest. The cameras went in over a 2-week stretch. I was not told exactly when. I was told to keep working my shift exactly the way I always had, and to not, under any circumstances, tip anyone off, including other staff. That was the hardest part. Kayla came back twice while the cameras were up, and I had to smile at her at the nurse's station and ask her how the drive-in was. She told me it was raining on the way in from Franklin. She told me her uncle was such a fighter. She asked me if I was getting enough sleep because I looked tired, honey. I told her I was fine. 3 weeks after my email, Dr. Bott called me into his office again. The attorney was there. There was a state investigator on the phone this time. They did not show me the footage. They told me what was on it, in careful, professional sentences. Kayla had brought a power of attorney reassignment for Mr. Ellis and had guided his hand across the signature line while telling him it was a birthday card for her daughter. The nephew who visited Miss Ruth had done something similar with a deed transfer on a house in Bellevue that Miss Ruth still technically owned. The daughter-in-law had gotten Mr. Delano onto a joint checking account and had already moved money out. The cousin visiting Miss Beverly had been the least careful of the 4 and had read parts of a will out loud to her in a voice like she was reading a bedtime story. They were, the investigator said, coordinating, not a crime ring in any dramatic sense, just a family that had figured out something ugly worked and had passed it around at Thanksgiving like a recipe. 6 people from that family were eventually charged. I do not know the final outcome for all of them. I know 2 took pleas. I know the house in Bellevue went back into Miss Ruth's name before she died the following spring. Mr. Ellis started talking again in January, a little. Not the grammar corrections, but he called me sugar once, in February, when I brought him his evening meds, and he said thank you, and he meant it kindly. I still work nights. I still walk into rooms without waiting for a response. Nobody has ever said anything to me about it. The job that eventually put me on the phone with a state investigator started with a normal referral in the first week of January 2021. A guy I'd wired up 2 dental offices for passed my number along, said his cousin ran a county political office out in Colorado, off the Front Range, and needed a full CCTV package installed before the end of the month. I'll call the client Marcus. That wasn't his name. Marcus was maybe 45, thick in the shoulders, dressed like a guy who thought a quarter zip counted as business casual. He met me in the parking lot behind the building the first time I came out to walk the site. It was one of those bright, dry Colorado mornings where the cold gets in through your jeans and you can see your breath, but the sky is completely clear. There was still black ice in the shady corners of the lot. The office itself sat on the second floor of a 2-story building, wedged between a state farm and a Mexican restaurant. Nothing fancy inside. Beige carpet with a coffee stain shaped like Michigan by the receptionist's desk. Drop ceilings. Framed campaign posters going back to cycles I barely remembered. Marcus walked me through the whole floor. Front lobby. 2 small offices. A break room with a coffee maker. A big conference room at the back with a long oval table, a whiteboard, and a flat screen mounted on a swivel arm. Standard package, he told me. Front door, back door, hallway, lobby, that little side entrance by the fire stairs. 6 cameras, 7 if you count the parking spot by the dumpster. Motion trigger on the outside stuff, 24/7 on the inside. I nodded, priced it in my head. Nothing weird about the ask. This kind of install is my bread and butter. We finished the walkthrough back at the conference room. He shut the door and stood there for a second with his hand on the knob. Then he did the thing people do when they're about to ask you something they already know isn't clean. He smiled a little too much and made his voice a little too casual. "One more thing," he said. "In here, I want a second camera. Small, hidden, not on the same system as the rest." I asked what he meant by not on the same system. "I want the feed going to a private server, my server, off-site, not the DVR you're putting in the front closet. And I don't want the staff aware of it. Not the front desk, not the volunteers. Just me." I asked what the second camera was for. He shrugged, and it was the kind of shrug you practice in the mirror. "Employee control," he said. "You know how it goes. People sit in that room for 2 hours at a stretch. They say things they shouldn't. They get on their phones instead of working. I want to know who's actually pulling their weight." The room had 4 chairs at the long table. I looked at those chairs and thought about how many people actually used that conference room in a week. Maybe 6, maybe 8 on a busy day. That is not a room you monitor for productivity. That is a room you monitor for what people say when they think nobody is listening. I told him it was doable. Pinhole in the ceiling tile, wired to a small NVR I could tuck above the drop ceiling, then a hard line out to whatever endpoint he wanted. I said it like I was quoting a standard job. How much extra? I gave him a number maybe 40% higher than it should have been, just to see what he'd do. He didn't blink. "Cash," he said. "Half up front, half when it's live. Nobody else on your crew hears about this piece. If anybody asks, the count is 6, not 7, not 8. I said fine. The next afternoon, he handed me an envelope in the parking lot. I counted it in the truck. It was all there. Hundreds, mostly crisp. A few older bills mixed in like he'd pulled them from more than one place. That should have been the moment I walked. Nobody hands over that kind of cash for employee productivity monitoring. I sat there with the envelope on my thigh and the heater blowing and watched him walk back into the building. Here is the part I'm not proud of. I drove home and I decided I'd do the job. I had a mortgage. My youngest was in braces. The state of Colorado does not care about your ethics. I did research that night. Just the office, public stuff, who worked there, what the office actually did, what boards it fed into. Turned out that conference room was where the county's election oversight committee did informal meetings. Not the official public ones, the other ones. The ones where members talked before they voted. January 2021, remember. A couple weeks after the general, right around when everything in DC was about to go loud. The kind of month where a private recording of a county election official saying the wrong thing off the cuff was worth actual money to somebody. I still did the job. I mean, the whole job. 6 visible cameras, cleanly labeled, DVR in the front closet, monitor at the receptionist's desk. Volunteers walked past me all day, and I made small talk about the weather and asked where the good coffee was. Then, on the second afternoon, alone at the end of the day, when everyone else had gone home, I went up on the ladder in the conference room, popped the tile above the light fixture, and put in the 7th camera. Pinhole through the tile, painted to match. Small board camera on a bracket I zip-tied to the HVAC run. NVR the size of a paperback, tucked behind a bundle of Cat 6. I ran a thin line back to the wall and into a jack he'd already had set up in his own office, going to a small router that wasn't on the main network. His own pipe out. Clean install. Anyone up on that ladder without a flashlight and a reason to look would miss it. Before I closed the tile, I did the thing that ended up mattering. I took photos. Not many. 4. The camera and its bracket. The NVR, with its serial number visible. The wiring path back to his office. The wall jack behind his desk, with the router. Time-stamped, on my personal phone, not the work one. I emailed them to myself and to a backup account I don't use for anything else, and I deleted them off the phone before I left the building. I didn't know yet what I was going to do with them. I only knew I wanted them off the site and out of my hands. Marcus walked the finished install with me that evening. Everything checked out. He clapped me on the shoulder in the conference room, standing directly under the pinhole, and told me I did good work. He gave me the second envelope in the same parking lot, in the same tone, like he was tipping a valet. He shook my hand and thanked me by name, and said he'd call me for any future work. I drove east on the highway, with the envelopes in my glove box and the sun going down red behind the mountains in my rear view. The truck cab smelled like cold coffee, and the heater fan clicked every few seconds, because there was a leaf stuck in the vent. I remember passing a semi with a Trump flag zip-tied to the mud flap. I got home. I sat in my driveway for a long time. The next morning I did 2 things. I opened a free email account through a VPN, one I've never used since. I wrote a short message. No name, no phone, just the facts. There is a hidden camera in the conference room at this address, feeding to a personal server owned by the office manager, installed without the knowledge of staff or the board. The room is used for closed election oversight discussions. I attached the 4 photos. I sent 1 copy to the county's Board of Election Supervisors. I sent a second copy to the municipal prosecutor's office, general intake. Then I closed the account, and I did not open it again for a long time. For about 3 weeks after that, nothing happened. I kept expecting a knock on my door. Every time an unknown number lit up my phone, I let it ring. I did jobs. I ate dinner. I watched the news at night, mostly with the sound off, waiting for the name of that office to come up in the crawl. It didn't. Then, on a Thursday in early February, my wife was reading something on her tablet at the kitchen table, and she said, "Isn't this that county you were working in?" She turned the screen. Local news site, 2 paragraphs. The office manager of the county political office had been placed on administrative leave pending the outcome of an internal investigation. No further details were being released. The county declined to comment. A quote from the board chair said only that they were cooperating fully with all appropriate authorities. That was it. No arrest, no charges, at least not that I ever saw reported. No follow-up piece I could find. His name just disappeared out of the little world he'd been running. I never got a call. Nobody ever came to the door. As far as any paper record goes, I installed a standard 6-camera system for a satisfied client in January of 2021 and cashed a normal check. The envelopes I kept. I didn't spend that cash. I put it in a coffee tin at the back of my garage, and I haven't touched it. I keep telling myself I'll donate it when the anniversary rolls around, and every year, I don't. The photos are still in the backup email account. I check the login once a year on a burner laptop, just to make sure the account is still there. It always is. Every time I close the browser, I sit for a minute with my hand on the mouse pad, and I think about the small red glow of that pinhole above the light fixture, and I wonder who else has been sitting in that conference room since. The paintings weren't the problem. The paintings were what we'd hoped for. It was the sneaker prints on the floor next to them that made me stop breathing for a second and just stand there with my headlamp shaking. This was July 2019, in a karst system in central Kentucky. I'm not going to name the cave. The permit was a mess even before this happened. The university lawyer got involved after, and part of the compromise was that certain coordinates never appear in writing again. So call it what the survey called it, which is basically a letter and a number. I was there with two colleagues, Ben, who handled rigging and comms, and Priya, who did the sediment work. Both of them stayed on the surface that day. It's not that we were being casual about safety. It's that the last leg into the chamber I was going into was too narrow to bring anyone else through in a reasonable amount of time. And we'd already burned 2 days on the survey. My job was to go in, photograph, sample, and come back. 2 hours in, 2 hours out, radio check every 20 minutes on a repeater Ben had strung down through the first 3 galleries. The way in was ugly. Not dangerous ugly, just unpleasant. You drop about 40 feet on rope, walk stooped through a passage that smells like wet limestone and something faintly like an aquarium filter. Then you get to a squeeze that any reasonable person would look at and say, no. It's maybe 18 inches at the tightest point, and it curves, which is worse than it sounds because your hips and your shoulders end up wanting to be in different rooms. I'm small. That's mostly why I was the one going in. I got through the squeeze on my second try. The first try I panicked a little and had to back out and breathe. Nothing to be proud of. It happens. Then I was in. The chamber on the other side was bigger than we'd guessed from the ground-penetrating survey. Maybe 30 feet across, low ceiling on one side, arching up to maybe 12 feet on the other. The floor was that fine, pale silt you get when water has been slowly rising and falling for a very long time, and there's nothing biological to muck it up. Undisturbed. That's the word I kept using in my head while I stood there getting my bearings. Undisturbed. I did the standard sweep first. Perimeter, ceiling, floor, corners. My headlamp caught the paintings on the second pass along the far wall. I want to be careful how I describe them because I've spent enough years around this material to know how easy it is to romanticize. They were pigment, red and a dark, almost black brown. Handprints, some of them, small ones, and a row of vertical marks like tallies, and one animal figure I still can't classify with any confidence. The style was not what I would have expected for the region. That alone would have been a career thing. I remember I laughed, actually laughed out loud in the chamber, because it was so much, and it was right there, and nobody else in the world had seen it. I got my camera up and started documenting. I was maybe 40 seconds into that when my light drifted down to the floor at the base of the wall. There were footprints in the silt. Not old ones, not the ghost of a print smoothed over by drip water. Fresh, sharp edges, a tread pattern I recognized immediately because I owned a pair of the same shoes in a different size. Solomon Trail Runners, men's, from the length. I paced one of the prints later against my own hand for scale, and I'd guess a US 11, maybe a 12. European 42, 43. The prints went from somewhere near the middle of the chamber, straight to the wall with the paintings, and back. Whoever it was had stood there, close enough to touch, then turned and walked away. I want to explain what happens in your head when you see something that can't be there. It's not fear right away. Fear is later. First, it's a kind of clerical refusal. You start listing reasons, another entrance. Water carried the prints in somehow. A previous team, kids, anything. I stood there and did that for maybe 2 minutes. The problem was I could see the whole chamber. There was no other opening. I mean that literally. I walked the perimeter twice with my hand on the wall, up as high as I could reach, down along the floor. Solid limestone, with a few small solution pockets, none of which a person could fit an arm into, let alone a body. The ceiling was intact. The only way in or out was the squeeze I had come through. And here's the part I keep coming back to. The silt in front of that squeeze, on the chamber side, was undisturbed except for my own prints. I could see exactly where I had come out. I could see the little skid where I'd pushed off with my boot to stand up. Nothing else. no prints leading to the squeeze from the sneaker set. They started in open floor, about 8 feet from the wall, walked to the wall, walked back, and ended in open floor, like someone had been set down there and then lifted away. I didn't think anything mystical in the moment. I thought I was missing something. I thought I was tired. I checked my radio. Ben was fine. Priya was fine. Everything on the surface was normal. They asked how it was going, and I said I'd found something and I needed a minute. Priya asked if I was okay, and I said yeah, I just needed a minute. I put the camera on the tripod and I photographed the prints from every angle I could get without stepping in the silt myself. I put a scale bar down next to one of them, one of those little folding ones with the centimeter markings, and I got a clean overhead. I did not touch the prints. I did not sample near them. I treated them the way you'd treat evidence, which is what my hands were doing before my head caught up. The whole time I was working, I kept my back to the wall with the paintings. I didn't want to face the middle of the chamber. That's the closest I'll come to describing what it felt like in there. I didn't want anything behind me. I finished in about 40 minutes instead of the 2 hours we'd planned. I told Ben I was coming out. He asked if the samples were good, and I said I had what I needed. Coming back through the squeeze was worse than going in, which is normal, and I skinned the inside of my left forearm on the curve, which I only noticed at the top of the rope. At the surface, it was late afternoon and hot in the way Kentucky gets in July, that wet heat that sits on you. Priya took one look at me and asked what happened. I told them both, straight through, no editorializing. Ben went quiet. Priya asked me twice if I was sure about the squeeze being the only opening. I said I was sure. We did not go back down that day. We sat at the trucks and drank warm water out of Nalgene's, and I showed them the photos on the camera's little screen. The next morning, Priya went down with me. She's smaller than I am, honestly, and faster in tight spaces. She did her own sweep of the chamber and confirmed what I'd said about the walls. Then she did the thing I hadn't thought to do. She examined the sediment on the chamber side of the squeeze, and then she went back out and examined the sediment on the outer side of the squeeze, in the passage. She spent almost an hour on it. She took cores, she photographed layering. Her conclusion, which is in the report in more careful language, was that the sediment on both sides of the squeeze showed continuous, undisturbed deposition, consistent with a chamber that had been effectively sealed by that constriction for a period she estimated in centuries at minimum. Nobody had come through that squeeze before I did, not recently, not in a long time. The prints were in the chamber. The chamber had been closed. Both were true. She said it flatly, the way she says everything, and then she said, I don't know what to do with that, and neither did I. We finished the survey. We wrote the paper. The paintings got the attention they deserved, and there is a whole small industry now of people arguing about their stylistic placement, which is fine. It's what should happen. In the site report, the footprints are one line. In the section on post-depositional disturbance, the line reads, essentially, that anomalous modern tread impressions were observed on the chamber floor and are presumed to represent contamination from a prior, unlicensed visit. That language was not mine. I signed the report anyway. Ben quit fieldwork about a year later and went into GIS consulting. He told me at a conference that it wasn't because of the cave, and I believe him, mostly. Priya still works. We don't talk about it unless we're drunk, and even then, not really. Once she said the thing I've been carrying since, which is that the shoes were the wrong detail. If it had been a bare footprint, or a moccasin, or anything old, we could have built a story. Trail runners with a tread pattern you can buy at REI made it something you can't put in a paper. I kept the photographs. They're on an external drive in a drawer in my office. I looked at them again last week, for reasons I don't want to get into, and the prints are exactly where they were, going to the wall, coming back, ending in open floor.